Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another weekly metagame breakdown for Legends of Runeterra. As usual, we're going to take a look at the latest top 5 most popular decks, as well as the top 5 highest win rate decks in Master right now, to give you a better idea of how the metagame is developing and what is particularly popular and why, and better understand what is going on, and also get a better idea on some of the lists that are most popular that you can sort of expect to face if you face a given archetype. So before we dive right in, you know the drill. Hit the subscribe button down below and let me briefly introduce you to today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN, one of the leading virtual private network providers out there. A virtual private network keeps your data secure and yourself anonymous while using the internet. NordVPN comes with super fast servers, allows you to unlock your favorite entertainment websites like Netflix. They provide a 30-day money-back guarantee. They also have an included cybersecurity suite, which acts as an ad blocker to boot. They don't lock any of your data, provide a 24/7 customer support, and you can use it on up to 6 simultaneous connections, so one account covers most or all of your electronic devices. And most importantly, they don't have any bandwidth limit, so you can use it non-stop without it getting throttled, which is particularly important for heavy users like us. It also won multiple awards and comes highly recommended by top technology experts. So if you're still surfing online without a VPN, now is the time to change that. Get NordVPN now, 70% off for a 3-year plan, including 1 month extra for free using the code ManuS or the personalized link in the description down below. And now on to today's content. Alright, so time to move on to the decks. So first off, in 5th place in terms of most popular decks, we have Azrael Karma. That's right, Azrael Karma made a comeback. It is overtaking Vi Heimerdinger as the most popular PNZ Ionia controlling style deck. I think in part that has to do with the nerf of Solitary Monk, which actually matters quite a bunch for Vi Heimerdinger, as well as some other changes in the metagame, like for example Noxus Arcos, from my impression, being a lot better against Vi Heimerdinger than against Azrael Karma, for example, and stuff like that. So yeah, what's there to say? I've been playing this deck quite a lot the last couple of streams. If you've been around, you know that. There's a bunch of things wrong with this list, I think, but it's a solid direction. This seems to be the most popular version right now, according to the data. But I will make a deck tag on my version and my insights from my testing later this week, over the weekend, so you'll get the full scoop. We have 1,312 games currently, and it's 50.9% win rate only, which is pretty low, but I think that's hugely deflated. From my own experience, I can say the deck, if you piloted it well, has a much higher win rate, and I still not an expert at the deck. I'm just pretty solid or pretty good at it, but not as good as I could be. And I'm still already having like a really good win rate. So this deck is pretty punishing to play, pretty hard to play. So there will be a lot of people that have barely a 50% win rate or even a below 50% win rate to the deck, I think. And that's probably a big part of what is pulling this down. And it also obviously gets a bit worse when your opponents are playing perfectly too, because the deck works with very small margins. So sometimes you only barely get there if you make no mistakes and your opponent makes some mistake somewhere. So keep that in mind. But all in all, I have been doing really well with the deck. The win percentage in the data is certainly misleading to its strengths. Alright, next we have the Noxus Freljord sort of mid-range control deck, Braum Swain. Yeah, not a whole lot to talk about here. This deck has been around for like a week or two, and it's lately taking off more and more. I think one of the big weaknesses of this deck is that it's pretty bad against Zed Karma Ezreal deck, but it is pretty good against some of the more unit heavy decks like Scouts and Noxus and that stuff, which is kind of where it shines. There's not a whole lot of configuration here. Basically, one of the newer additions was Ice Veil Archer over Avarosan Sentry, as made by BBG, and he also added 2 Bjergs over the single Avalanche and the 3rd Demolitionist from the original list. But other than that, that is very stock. Swim messed around with like 2 Death Hand and 0 Bjerg, and instead still keeping the 3 Sentry. But other than that, there's really not a whole lot of flex room. Basically, the deck just kind of builds itself mostly. It's a very robust deck. I don't think it's a tier 1 deck probably, simply because it is kind of a bit narrow in what it does. It's pretty good against like aggressive unit decks of a certain kind, but it has really issues with stuff like elusives and other like more controlling decks that sort of go over you, like PNZ Ionia decks and stuff like that. The way elusives beats this usually is by making big elusives with Protector, which this deck is very poorly equipped to handle reliably, since they usually need to use their like damage removal on smaller elusives early, so they can't like double spell big elusives all willy-nilly, which is why my experience has been with elusives against this deck. That's a pretty good matchup. Like, it's the kind of deck that elusives is usually good against, since the removal is and sort of interaction is weaker than, say, in Ezreal Karma, which is a bad matchup for elusives usually because they have more interaction and they have more ways to deal with bigger units like Will and Palm and so on. But yeah, as you can see, about as popular as Ezreal Karma right now. Notably higher win rate, in part because it has more sort of raw power and a more straightforward game plan, is easier to pilot, but I think overall it is actually a worse deck than Ezreal Karma, if you can pilot both well. At least that's my opinion. I've played the deck a bunch and I've been very underwhelmed by it, as opposed to Karma Ezreal. Like, it's a fine deck, it's alright, but it feels very fair and like very like narrow-minded at what it can and can't do, and yeah, it just kind of gets outshined by the more powerful sort of more flexible decks. Next we have Scouts. Once again here I lumped together the Lucian Misfortune and the Quinn Misfortune variants to arrive at these numbers. That also gives us a 53% win rate, so once again we can see deck is slightly more popular, win rate is lower. Interestingly enough, right now the win rate for the Quinn version is notably higher, which is kind of weird since before I think it was the other way around, but the sample sizes are pretty similar for both, so it might very well just be variance, I'm not sure. I doubt that the metagame shifted in a way that suddenly Quinn Misfortune is better than Lucian Misfortune. That just doesn't make much sense. So the most likely case is that neither the fact that Lucian had a higher win rate nor Quinn had a higher win rate is a clear indicator of which one is better, and there's some sort of variance fluctuation going on, since I don't think it's particularly metagame dependent whether Lucian or Quinn is better, and especially not to an extent that the win rates are strongly different. So I would basically leave it to individual testing to figure out which one you think is better and works. I've been messing around with Scouts, not a big fan of the deck, it just feels a bit too fair and underpowered, and once again narrow-minded in the sense that once the opponent has enough units and kind of stabilizes the board, there's not really much you can do, especially if they have a way to deal with your misfortune, which is like your only saving grace usually when they have a lot of board. So in a lot of cases this is kind of rough. It's one of the better decks against Ezreal Karma, but it's not even like insane against it, I think. But yeah, and in theory I think Lucian would make more sense because it makes the deck lower curve, leans more into its aggressiveness, lets you develop more board faster, which also plays better with Relentless Pursuit and Misfortune and Bannerman. And it also gives you a nice 3-drop in the form of Zena, which is another like very aggressive 3-drop that hits hard now that Badger Bear is less aggressive than it used to be, while the Quinn version is sort of more mid-rangey and a bit slower and clunkier, but in return you get sort of another sort of scary level up champion that is in a way easier to level up than Lucian, I guess, and less fragile. But I just feel like Quinn doesn't really play to the deck strengths, while Lucian Senna does that a lot better. So that's the direction I'm leaning in, what I've liked when I tried the deck. But yeah, deck has been doing okay for me, but not good enough that I actively want to like play it on ladder and climb with it, honestly. Just not that great. Win rate 53%. It's alright relative to what we've seen so far. Certainly better, and my win rate was higher and would be higher, but relative to the win rates I had with other decks, still very medium win rate in context. Then we have Ash Cedroni. This deck is very popular right now because we have actually quite a lot of unit decks. We have Scouts, we have Noxus aggro, a bunch of random stuff, even stuff like Braum, Swain. Seems like a very solid matchup for a deck like this, because you're still basically playing a mid-range on mid-range matchup, and that's where Cedroni excels, which is why it's one of the most popular decks right now. The win rate is actually a bit staggering to me, 57.8%, really high relative to other things. I do like this list, like Fresh Lobster has went into a kind of solid direction here. The two things I don't like or I'm not sure about is, I think the two one-offs are pretty bad, and not running any Elixir in the deck is very, very wrong. Elixir is so good. It's so good with Ash, it's so good with Kato, it's so good with Glory Seeker, it's so good in random situations on any unit, it's so cheap. And Flash Freeze is such a bad card, and Fury is really clunky and mostly does what Elixir would do for 1 mana in the deck a lot of the time. So would totally swap those for Elixir. And I'm not 100% sure if the Trifarians are the right call. Could see something like Drummer being better, but Trifarian is good in the matchups where you need to pressure, like against more controlling decks that can be tougher matchups, and also plays really well with like a turn 4 or 5 Reckoning and stuff like that. So I'm a bit undecided on that front. But yeah, all in all, this list is going into a pretty solid direction. The third Cedroni is also something that I could see questioning. Deck has a lot of 6s. Cedroni is a bit clunky, and she's a very solid card, but she's nothing too special in a deck that basically never levels her. So she's mostly just like a 6-cost 5/6 overwhelm that gives freeze and vulnerable to a unit the turn you play it. And her spell is solid. That's another way, like you get Furies from Cedroni if you draw multiples, so you really don't want that one of Fury in my opinion, since Fury is not actually a good card in most situations in the deck in my experience. But yeah, this deck is super popular right now and doing really well, as you can see, so you certainly don't want to be playing a deck that is bad against it. Another reason why I'm not a big fan of Scouts, because I've historically these kind of Demacia unit decks have really struggled against something like this, and Reckoning is particularly bad if most of your units die to it and you don't have something like a Deny. So yeah, can't recommend playing a deck that loses to this deck. And then we have Noxus still in first place, still the most popular deck if you combine the Draven Darius and Elise Darius variants. If you don't, it's a few games behind the Ash Noxus deck if you just take the Draven Darius variants, but they are really the same deck. One champion difference doesn't make sense to separate them. Overall win rate here, notably lower, but still the second highest we've seen of the popular decks, 54.7%. Once again, weirdly enough, last week the win rate for Elise was 2% lower than for Darius Draven. Now it's kind of the opposite. The Draven Darius win rate is much, much lower than the Elise Darius win rate. And once again, I don't think that is a result of the metagame changing to make one better than the other. I still believe Draven Darius is much, much better than Elise Darius for the reasons I outlined in my deck tech, allegiance, and so on. I think, like, what I'm starting to think is what might be the case is, as we can see here, one commonality between like the Scouts and the Noxus case here is that both we are in the second week. We are in both cases seeing the win rate of the more popular variant going down, despite them not being different in a way that is exploitable and that people could like prepare for and exploit it, and therefore the less popular variant would have an advantage. So what I think is probably a larger range of people is playing the popular variant, driving down the win rate, because the larger the population is that plays it, the wider the skill range usually will be that plays the deck, which brings down the average win rate, while the less popular decks are played by a smaller group of people, sometimes a particularly high skill level group of people that are particularly dedicated to it, and therefore have a win rate that's much closer to the win rate of, say, a good player playing the deck, rather than the win rate of the average player in Masters, which has a huge difference. Like, that's the thing, like, just because you're in Masters, that doesn't mean you're like good at Runeterra. Just means you're better at Runeterra than the non-Masters people. But there's still like comparably fairly weak players in Master relative to the top players in Master. And I think that's what is happening there. If you take the win rate of the top level players and compare it to the win rate, to the average win rate of all players in Master, you get these discrepancies. And I would guess that is the reason for these discrepancies. But that's once again just a theory, and one that will be hard to prove. But I'm just trying to make sense of the discrepancy that doesn't make sense on other theoretical levels, neither on the theory crafting for the deck building, nor on the aspect that there's some vulnerability that one version has that the other hasn't, that the metagame is exploiting now that it wasn't before or something. Since the differences are too minor for that. They're not like major functional differences. All right, so yeah, not that much has changed, but we're seeing some shift around, especially the major rise and success of Cedroni, which is still a bit surprising to me. I played the deck a bunch. It's very solid, like it's not a bad deck, but it still doesn't feel like that great to me. Like, I played it and it certainly felt, and also in terms of actual win rate, performed notably worse than Noxus Harrying or Braum Elusives for me, or Karma Ezreal. All three of these decks felt and did much, much better in the win rate when I played them. So, yeah, would still think the Cedroni deck is more of an inherent tier 2 deck that is just kind of running hot right now because there's a bunch of good matchups for it. And yeah, maybe that's what it is, but there's also the potential for me to be wrong and it is better than I think it is. But it's not like I'm just theorizing here. I played like more than 30 games with the deck and I didn't hate it, but ultimately I got away with a significantly worse record than I had with other decks, and also a worse impression of how the deck feels in the games and how it plays out than some of the other decks. So if you want to play units, even with a lot of Cedroni, you're probably still better off playing Nox Harrying than Ashe, if you ask me. Even though the win rate might suggest otherwise, but that's the thing. The stats have their issues. They are just ultimately, in a way, one data point, because there's so many factors factoring into the stats here that they only can give us like an idea in a direction. and not as much of definitive answers, because there's a lot of stuff that you can't sort of account for easily to sort this stuff out all the time. And obviously there's also the potential that I am wrong and Cedroni actually is a better deck than Noxus Herring, but I really doubt that, and I think a lot of like better players would probably agree that in a vacuum, like Herring Noxus is the stronger, more powerful deck, while the Cedroni deck might be the better positioned one right now. But we'll see. Maybe just talk to some people, ask them yourselves, see what other people think about it. Alright, this concludes the top 5 most played decks. Now we'll take a look at some of the top 5 highest win rate decks. And one thing that we will see there and have seen there before is that a lot of the like highest win rate decks are usually like smaller sample size decks, which can have to do with multiple things. Like this, for example. One of the things is lower sample size, so variance. The other thing is maybe it's a few dedicated better players playing the deck that have discovered it because they're more in tune with the community, so they discover new ideas quicker and latch onto them more, making the average play skill of the pilot of that archetype higher than the average play skill like across the like more popular decks and so on. So that might be a further data point to indicate that there might be something to my theory from earlier. Anyway, this is basically Scouts, except it's splashing Zed instead of Misfortune, and yeah, playing Laurent Protégé as well to sort of yeah, control the board. I've played similar stuff before, as you full well know. It was really good before Badger Bear got nerfed. Not sure how I feel about it now. Messed around with it a bit, felt okay, but not great, not remotely as good as it felt when I liked it and made the deck. But yeah, it's the 5th place right now, 54.8% over 436 games. Wanted to highlight this here because it is doing better than Scouts, but the sample size is obviously also lower, so take that with a grain of salt, but might be worth exploring. Zed is a really powerful unit, and against something like Karma Ezreal, having a Zed that you can protect with Ranger's Resolve seems like a much stronger card than Misfortune, which is better against other unit decks. Then we have the Noxus Herring deck. Here we're only looking at the Draven Darius variant, which actually has a win rate of 55%. Actually, let me check that again, if this was the whole yeah, it's 55% for Draven Darius, and the Elise variant technically has 59.0%, and if we look at the archetype as a whole, we get away with 54.7%. But I didn't want to like take the Elise variant because and put it in here, so I want to be honest about that, since I really am convinced that it is really bad to play more than 6 non-Noxus cards in this deck, and it's probably even bad to play more than 3 or 4. Since every time you play a Basilisk Rider on 4 and it turns into a 5/3 no overwhelm, you're gonna lose matchups that put up a fight automatically, basically. So don't do that. Every time my opponent plays a Basilisk Rider and it whiffs, I'm basically rejoicing and I'm like, okay, this matchup at this game is gonna be pretty easy. So I took the version that I know to be the best and took the win rate because for some weird reason, despite the Elise Draven variant, it kind of gets diluted. I don't know sometimes how mobalytics works. Obviously, the thing is we can't look at the win rate of just Draven Darius and Elise Darius together. We can just look at like Noxus Shadow Isles combined. And since that is almost only these decks, it's fine, but there seem to be other decks in it, otherwise we wouldn't get to this win rate. Since obviously, if this is 55% and the Elise Darius deck has 59%, if you put them together, the win rate should be higher than 55%, not for 54.7%. So there is some other decks in there that are Noxus Shadow Isles that have a really poor win rate that kind of drag things down. So I figured the best solution is probably just take Draven Darius insulated here, only the games from that, and 55%. Still, the win rate of the deck might be slightly higher overall. Kind of hard to say. Like I said, the data is sometimes a bit weird, but this is what I settled on. Next, we have another more experimental deck. It's Bromlax Poros. This has been played the most by Sishu in the top 20 master or something, so he has done pretty decent. So a lot of the games will be from him and from people that watched his stream and liked the list. So yeah, that's probably partially why the win rate is so high, because it was largely played by a good high level player. And if that deck would become popular and everybody would play it, the win rate would probably go way below 55%. Since the deck is probably not actually that great, it's solid if you play it really well and you can like get a positive win rate with it, but it's like nowhere near the win rates of the like top decks. But if you're looking for something interesting and fun and want to play Poros and are a good pilot, maybe this is something for you. Then we have the Ash Noxus deck. Like I said, 57.8% win rate. Second most popular deck, second highest win rate. Nothing too surprising here. And last but not least, we have Zed Braum. Win rate is pretty low. This is one of the versions I have been playing on my stream a lot. There were a few cards that I kept changing back and forth. This was the first version basically that I tweeted out and that I have been playing on my stream. I have experimented with 2 mask makers. I have experimented with 2 denies. Keeper of masks, not mask maker. Stuff like that. But other than that, a decent part of this sample size actually is from myself, probably like 40-50 games at the very least, and from people that have watched my stream, watched my deck tech, seen my tweets about it, and yeah, the deck is really good. I can very much recommend it. It's, in my opinion, still one of the best decks. The biggest crux right now is with the popularity of Ezreal Karma, at least at the higher ranks. This is a bit rough, since that matchup is pretty rough and unfavorable. I don't know how unfavorable, but pretty sure it is unfavorable to some degree, but not unwinnable probably. And definitely a good deck. What I would probably do with this list is I would cut the third elixir for a second deny. To deny is kind of necessary against some stuff like Zed Braum, for example, I think. And the third elixir has been a bit hit or miss at times. So I like that change the most. I think Fury adds more to the deck. There's no way you don't run 3 Will right now. And then the other option would be something like, I don't know, cutting a Protector for a deny, and I don't really like that either. I think Protector is a pretty important additional angle. Like I mentioned, some decks like Braum, Swain just really struggle against Protector buffed units, and so does Karma Ezreal sometimes if they don't draw their like big unit answers, because they're really good at shooting down your small units or blocking them with their assassins. So you gotta make bigger units, and that's an important aspect of elusives, to not just have small evasive units, but also be able to make individual big threats or go wide with hatchling. Those are like the 3 angles basically, like low curve beatdown, big must answer evasive threats, and go wide boards. And if you can handle all 3, you beat the deck, but most decks can't handle all 3. Obviously, as you can see, the sample size is really low, and this win rate would also go down if a wide range of people would play the deck, because we've seen that before. Even though to me the deck seems not that hard to play, that's because I'm very used to it. It's the kind of deck I like and I'm good at, and I prefer playing. But I see a lot of people making a lot of mistakes with the deck, and that means a lot of the closer, more challenging matchups where you win by the skin of your teeth, you will lose and the win rate will go down. But yeah, my win rate right now over I think 70 games or so is something like 67% win rate or something, which is pretty great, and it's still one of my go-to decks, and I really like it and can really recommend it. All right, that concludes this week's review of the top 5 most popular and top 5 highest win rate decks. I try to put some more interesting, lower sample size decks into the win rate category if I have some knowledge of them and experience knowing that they're actually not just high rolling, but good decks and just have a high win rate because there aren't as many sort of weaker players playing them as opposed to some of the larger sample size sets, and highlight this so it can still highlight some up and coming promising things you might want to give a go if you don't want to play the same old. And also because otherwise we would see very low win rates of mostly the same decks that are popular if you set the bar too high in terms of when you consider a deck for this category. So I hope you don't mind the liberty that I'm sort of taking in the highest win rate category. I'm just trying to bring you some interesting, promising, not so popular decks yet that might be worth picking up and piloting well to succeed on ladder. All right, as usual, guys, let me know in the comments what you think and what you would like to see in the future in terms of content. Always happy to hear from you guys and bring you the best content possible. That's it again for this time. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on notification icon to not miss out on future content. Please consider turning off your ad block or whitelisting YouTube so you can support your favorite content creators for free. Not just me, but everyone you're watching on YouTube would really appreciate it. You can find all the sponsor information, stream, how to support the content further with Patreon donations and so on, all in the description down below by clicking show more under the stream. And yeah, thanks for watching, everybody. I'm your host ManuS, and I'll see you next time.